Hello there, guys. Yes, after all these years, Cryptid Profile is back, and today we are talking about Bigfoot, a highly requested cryptid that basically needs no introduction. Somewhere between 10 to 13% of Americans believe Bigfoot, or Sasquatch as it is sometimes called, is a real living creature, and that there is a small population of this elusive ape species still hiding out within the forests of North America. Without a doubt, it is the most famous and most sought after cryptid. There is so much material to discuss when it comes to Bigfoot, to the point that you could build, and people have built, entire museums and libraries around the creature. Because of this, I thought it best to start by examining just one aspect of the Bigfoot phenomena, and for the time being, ignore everything else. Ignore the footprints, and the photographs, and the eyewitness reports, and the butt prints? In preparation for this video, I totally immersed myself in Bigfoot believing culture. The culture of the 10 to 13% of people fully convinced that Bigfoot exists. I wanted to truly understand their position and why they are so convinced. I watched several Bigfoot documentaries, read several Bigfoot books written by Bigfoot experts, and visited several Bigfoot-themed museums across the country. It was a long journey that took me over 2 years, and from coast to coast of the United States. I saw things you people wouldn't believe. Out of all the evidence I encountered, there was one aspect of Bigfoot that the anthropologist in me found most intriguing. And this was the claim that Bigfoot, or Sasquatch as we know it, commonly appears in Native American stories and folklore. The indigenous peoples of North America, collectively and variously known as Native Americans, American Indians, or First Nations, have been living on this continent for tens of thousands of years. Since time immemorial, they have been learning, dreaming, and thriving in this land. And like any other people, they told stories. Stories about anything and everything, from what plants were safe or poisonous, to recollections of long-standing feuds between different tribes, to humanity's place in the cosmos and the origins of the universe. Legends, mythologies, histories, and any other type of story you can think of. For the majority of history, many of these people did not have writing, and so these stories and traditions were passed down by word of mouth from generation to generation. Whole Bibles worth of information kept alive by skilled storytellers and elders. Some, but unfortunately not all of these stories survive to this day within living communities. Some of these have even been recorded on pen and paper and translated into English for outsiders to enjoy. A significant amount of Bigfoot enthusiasts have taken a keen interest in these Native American stories, as they believe the creature known to us as Bigfoot was commonly known to the various cultures and tribes of the past by a different name. Although each tribe had a unique name for the creature we now call Bigfoot, many seem to describe the same entity. Of course, none of these stories directly use the term Bigfoot, but that would be expected since the term was only invented in the 1950s. Native Americans and First Nation peoples have been in North America for thousands of years. Their interaction with the environment left them as experts of nature. If Bigfoot is real, Native people would have the earliest and longest contact with the species. Their experiences would be recorded in their stories and traditions. This concept, that descriptions of a creature like Bigfoot can consistently be found in the stories of tribes across North America, is widespread within the Bigfoot believing community. For example, the Expedition Bigfoot Museum in Georgia devotes an entire section of the museum to this claim. An exhibit shows a wall of masks and artwork claiming to be Native American depictions of Bigfoot. There is an animated movie that repeats this claim, and even a sign that displays a list of 76, quote, Native American Sasquatch names. Likewise, Bigfoot documentaries commonly reserve a segment of the runtime to briefly mention Native American stories, supposedly describing a creature like Bigfoot.
The names of the creature across the country vary from tribe to tribe. Stickman, Basket Woman, Yayali. Yet descriptions are remarkably similar, despite the large distances between tribes. Distances that would have made it difficult, if not impossible, to share information about the creature.
Lauren Coleman, a prominent cryptozoologist and Bigfoot expert, once stated, "The first Americans acknowledged these hairy races, and their tales come down to us in the records that ethnographers, folklorists, and anthropologists have preserved and overlooked essays on hairy giant legends and myths. Examining these closely, a pattern begins to emerge of Bigfoot revealed." The local Native American, Native Canadian, and Inuit accounts discuss the ancient traditions of these hairy human-like beings with words special for each linguistic and tribal group. It is often driven home that these descriptions are not of spiritual or supernatural beings, but real flesh and blood creatures.
There is no tribe that suggests that he is anything other than a physical being, living in the same physical dimensions as humans and other animals.
Landmark Bigfoot expert John Green once criticized anthropologists in general for underappreciating or ignoring Indian accounts of the Sasquatch. "I am certain that they would treat the Sasquatch by any of its various names as a mythical being, no matter what an Indian informant might tell them." There are countless Bigfoot books and publications that promote or at least discuss this idea. Several pieces of indigenous artwork are often claimed to be depictions of Bigfoot. Many gift shops around the country sell merchandise using similar portrayals of Bigfoot that imitate Native American art styles. The notion that Native Americans and Bigfoot have an ancient and deep connection is so commonplace that it even ends up in Bigfoot movies, like the critically acclaimed Suburban Sasquatch. Even one of the most popular alternative names for Bigfoot, the Sasquatch, has Native American origins. Bigfoot being supported by Native American folklore is so commonplace that it has seemingly been accepted as fact by the entirety of the Bigfoot-believing community. It is something nobody even seems to question within these circles. Bigfoot proponents find the prevalence of these stories to be strong evidence confirming the existence of an upright walking, non-human ape existing in North America for thousands of years. It shows that the creature is not a recent phenomena, but something people on this continent have been seeing for a long time. And I will admit, it would be strange if the indigenous peoples of the Americas, who lived here for tens of thousands of years, didn't record the existence of something like Bigfoot if it existed. It is perfectly logical to infer that if Bigfoot existed, creatures matching its description should appear in Native American stories and art. And Bigfoot believers, or Bigfooters as they sometimes call themselves, claim this is in fact the case. The evidence is all around us. But is it really though? Here's the thing. Throughout my research, I saw a lot of Native American words and artwork thrown around and quoted in books, TV shows, and museums. But most of these sources leave it at that. They don't dig deeper than the surface level or really tell you what these stories say about the creatures named. It appears that few people, even within the Bigfoot community, have actually taken the time to go through these stories and examine the details. And as far as I know, nobody has done something this extensive from a skeptical point of view. I wanted to come in as an outside party to investigate the veracity of such a big claim. Are Bigfoot-like creatures really mentioned in Native American stories, legends, and folklore? To begin my project, I thought it best to gather a thorough list of all the names claimed to represent Native American accounts of Bigfoot. Assembling a list like this wasn't that hard. As mentioned in the intro, the Museum Expedition Bigfoot provides its visitors with one such list, containing the names of 76 different creatures and the Native American culture groups or tribes from which they originate. Lists like these are common among Bigfoot publications. I collected at least 6 different ones. But there was one list that was well regarded as the most comprehensive collection of indigenous stories and a must-read for any cryptozoologist. A book titled Giants, Cannibals, and Monsters, Bigfoot in Native Culture by Kathy Moskowitz-Strain. Whenever I tried to find information on the native Bigfoot, I kept on encountering this particular book and its author. I found it in the gift shops for both Expedition Bigfoot in Georgia and Sasquatch the Legend in Forks, Washington. Yes, I visited both these locations in person for this video. Several famous Bigfoot influencers and experts have recommended this book. Kathy Moskowitz-Strain herself is highly regarded among Bigfoot experts. She gave a lecture on Native American knowledge of Sasquatch at the International Cryptozoology Conference in 2016. Loren Coleman, one of the most famous cryptozoologists in the world, has recommended Kathy for the Bigfooter of the Year award for her research. Rictor Riolo of Spike TV fame stated in a review that Kathy Strain is my personal Obi-Wan Kenobi and mentor. The photos, the history, and dedication Mrs. Strain gave this book will enrich you as the reader. To know about Sasquatch, you must know about the people that first told the white man about these hairy giants, monsters, and cannibals. It is not unfair to say that this book and its author are considered the foremost authorities on Bigfoot in Native American culture by the wider Bigfoot community. So I thought it wise to buy myself a copy. Well, 2 copies. Kathy's book is very comprehensive and I dare say impressive. It contains around 142 different names, collected from 57 different tribes or cultural groups, for creatures that Kathy regards as Bigfoot-like in nature. She created this collection by reading tons of different Native American stories, collected from many sources and many different tribes. And thankfully for us, Kathy reproduced all these stories in her book, 157 of them in total. At first glance, it is a very impressive collection, and the sheer number of stories pleads a strong case in favor of the Bigfoot cause. For each one, Kathy Strain provided details or citations on the primary sources, where each story originally came from. This is important as it tells us things like who told the story, what tribe or nation were they from, and on what year were they recorded or at least published. These primary sources vary greatly. The vast majority of them were interviews with Native American elders that were typically conducted by anthropologists for academic research. These primarily white visitors listened to the tales told by native storytellers and rendered them into English and into writing. Other examples were published by Native American storytellers directly, who wanted to record these stories in writing for posterity's sake. They range in dates of publishing from the 1830s to the early 2000s. The inclusions of dates in particular is very helpful in our examination, as most, if not all, these stories originated as oral traditions, stories that were told but not written down for possibly as long as centuries. Because of this, in some ways it is impossible to know how much of their original details may or may not have changed over time, like in a game of telephone. Some of the stories mention cows, iron kettles, 12-gauge shotguns, and chewing gum, which implies their settings take place at least after colonization. Even if the core of the stories are ancient, their details reveal that some have been slightly modified with time, as later storytellers revised or added details to the original telling. So when we see that a story was written down at a particular time, it can only give us a window into how it was told at that time in history, and not exactly how it was told in its original telling, which may have been several centuries before. For this project, I wanted to read through every single one of Kathy Strain's 157 Native American stories, and check if the creatures described really sound like descriptions of Bigfoots as she and other Bigfoot experts have asserted. I also compared all 6 of the lists I collected from different Bigfoot sources to see where they agreed and disagreed. These were Kathy Strain, Wayne Suttles, Expedition Bigfoot, Christopher L. Murphy, Monster Quest, and Loren Coleman. I wanted to go further and create an even more comprehensive list than anyone before me, and like any nerd, I did it with a spreadsheet. Before even reading a single one of these stories, I needed clear criteria for what even counts or qualifies as a Bigfoot-like creature. This was often never clarified by the sources that provided the Native American Bigfoot lists, but after immersing myself in the Bigfoot community for so long and so deeply, I was kind of a pro at this. My conditions were that in order to qualify as a Bigfoot-like creature, the creature in the story had to be explicitly described as man-like in shape, standing upright on 2 legs and having 2 arms, almost completely covered in hair, large in size, at least taller than your average adult human, and technologically limited. That is to say, they don't live in houses or use fire or tools more complex than sticks. This is all something most Bigfooters agree on, though there are outliers. Bigfoot, or Sasquatch, as most people understand them, are also incapable of human speech. If they have the capacity for language, the vast majority of researchers agree they can't speak the language of humans. Though again, there are outliers. There are also some fringe Bigfoot believers who claim the creature is a spiritual or interdimensional being. But again, this is a fringe opinion that Kathy Strain, among other notable cryptozoologists, don't follow. Most believe it is a flesh and blood creature. For our purposes, these criteria were very loosely applied to our examination of these stories. In order to be considered Bigfoot-like by my personal qualifications, a described creature needed to hit at least 2 of the listed conditions, hopefully more or all of them. Some people might agree with me, some won't, and that's okay. This is just my own personal qualifications. As I went along reading, I checked off details I found in the stories and put them into my spreadsheet, so that everything was in one centralized database. My spreadsheet consisted of the name of the creature, sometimes the native name spelled phonetically, sometimes just the English translation, the name of the culture or tribe that told the story, the date of recording, and a short summary of how the creature was described, if at all, in the story, and a further breakdown of details I will cover later. The nature of the spreadsheet allowed me to quantify all these findings into overall percentages. By the time this video is out, I hope that it is publicly available for everyone to fact check me on too. In total, I researched 154 different Native American creatures, and read maybe around 170 different stories. Admittedly, some of the names in the stories were repeats that represented slight regional variations of the same story or creature. Around 75% were found in Kathy's book, Giants, Cannibals, and Monsters. Some of the stories were extremely short, maybe just a paragraph, while others were a bit longer. The oldest was recorded in 1791, the youngest was recorded in 2005. Others had no date of recording whatsoever. The actual substance of the stories was a huge mix. Some were creation stories or myths, trying to explain why the world is the way it is. Why do humans walk on 2 legs? Where do mosquitoes come from? Why are ticks flat? Others were legends about the deeds of great heroes, similar to the trials of Hercules, King Arthur, or Gilgamesh. Others still were cautionary tales and parables, meant primarily to teach children a valuable moral lesson, akin to something like Aesop's fables or Grimm's fairy tales. There were funny stories and scary stories, histories and eyewitness accounts. There was often a lot of overlap between these groupings, and they were definitely not mutually exclusive. Throughout them, the line between what we consider the physical and spiritual world was blurred. Magic, gods and goddesses, spirits, and the personifications of animals, plants, and nature all made regular appearances. As for the creatures themselves, if I talked about each individual one, this video would be 10 hours long, so I will focus on the major findings. My research found, and I was incredibly generous here, only 17 out of the 154 creatures could be described as Bigfoot-like by my broad definition. This represented only 11% of the entire list. The rest of the creatures, the remaining 89%, failed to meet my criteria, and most didn't even come close. The main disqualifiers, though even here I was again forgiving, was the clearly human traits many of these beings displayed. 71 or 46% of them were explicitly described as speaking the languages of Indians, Native Americans, or sometimes even that of white people. They communicate with the humans in the stories very clearly. Now, in defense of Bigfooters, this isn't exactly surprising, as so do many of the other quote-unquote real animals in the stories. Rabbits, deer, bears, frogs, fish, and bugs are regularly anthropomorphized, so that they talk like people. It is just important to point out that in almost half the stories, the supposed Bigfoot-like creatures can talk, a trait few will claim Bigfoot is actually capable of. 48 or 31% of the creatures were explicitly described as using tools more complex than sticks or branches. Among the tools, some of the beings were described as using were bows and arrows, axes, pots, pans, guns, baskets, smoking pipes, nets, and canoes, among other things. All of these inventions are tools most Bigfooters agree the species is incapable of creating and probably using. 14 or 9% of the creatures were explicitly described as wearing clothes. The stories mention them wearing shirts, hats, wooden masks, shoes or moccasins, leggings, and dresses. 20 or 13% of the creatures were explicitly described as living in artificial homes, either wooden log cabins and lodges or tents and teepees. A couple were even described as living in whole villages. 31 or 20% of the creatures were explicitly described as using fire, either to cook meat, smoke tobacco pipes, boil water, or heat and light their homes. All of these are behaviors Bigfoot is generally not known to do, but even ignoring this, most of the physical descriptions of the creatures do not match that of a Bigfoot either. If so few creatures met the criteria, what then is on the rest of the list advertised by Bigfoot believers? What is the other 89%? The other 89%. Well, to start, I found that 37, or around a fourth of all the creatures on the list, had no description at all. In the stories, they are simply referred to as the giant, or the monster, or the cannibal, and never described beyond this name. They are kept so vague that no determination of what they actually look like can be made based on the details in the stories alone. In my opinion, we are in no position to really see if they are Bigfoot-like or not. Because of this, I feel like they probably shouldn't be included on the Bigfoot list. It would be disingenuous. For the creatures we do have descriptions for, however, I found that they could be sorted into 5 main groups: chimeras, spirits, shapeshifters and personifications, giants and dwarves, wild Indians, and basket women. Chimeras. A good portion of the creatures described were what I like to call chimeras, mythological monsters that have body parts taken from several different animals or body parts in an abnormal quantity, just like many of the monsters from Greek mythology. Included on the list of Bigfoot-like creatures is, I kid you not, a snake with big feet. There was a snake that was different from other snakes. He had feet, big feet. The other snakes, because he was different, hated him and made his life wretched for him. Snake with big feet, Cherokee. Ottermen, half human, half otter shapeshifters, something like the Native American equivalent of mermaids or mermen. Owl men and women, werewolf-like creatures, half man, half wolf. Minotaur or satyr-like men with sharp pointy teeth and cow hooves, and could wield axes. Elf-like people that hopped around on one leg. Giant floating heads with a pair of broad wings like those of a bat, and talons or claws like a bird. A wooden golem, in other words a magical robot, with a crystal heart and shell lungs and liver, created by sorcerers to stop overpopulation. Many of these very clearly do not sound like Bigfoot, or even Bigfoot-like in the slightest, and it is somewhat surprising that they could even be considered in the first place. Take for example Doubleface of the Sioux. In Bigfoot-believing publications, Doubleface is often erroneously conflated with Iktomi, a trickster spirit. But when you read the Lakota stories that mention them, they're in fact 2 distinct beings. In any case, Doubleface or the Double-Faced Ghost, or Double-Faced Woman, or Two-Face, is a gender-ambiguous monster with a face on both the front and back of its head. In 1901, the Sioux storyteller Zakala Shah described Doubleface like this: "The terrible monster with a face in front and one in the back of his head, and a giant with large funnel-like ears, who lingers on the outskirts of camps waiting to snatch children. He throws these children in his ears and takes them away." In these stories, Doubleface talks, plays tricks, and even wears a catskin loincloth. Doubleface sounds like something more akin to the Cyclops of Greek mythology than a literal Bigfoot. I even found 2 artistic depictions of Doubleface, which again depict them with 2 faces on the front and back of the head. Nonetheless, respected Bigfoot experts seem to consider Doubleface a Bigfoot-like creature. Spirits, shapeshifters, and personifications. A kind of catch-all group I had to create was one for entities that were very clearly spirits or magical beings. The Sitko of the Puyallup are described as the spirits of people from different tribes who have been cast out because of their wickedness, alternatively translated as demons. Again, despite this, the Sitko can be found listed in both Giants, Cannibals, and Monsters and Expedition Bigfoot's lists. The Skenicum of the Colville can turn into trees. The Siatquo of the Twana can turn invisible. The Sanahaha of the Southern Paiute is capable of killing people by just looking at them, like Medusa. The Chiatanka, or Big Man of the Sioux, is explicitly said to exist in another dimension from us. He is capable of changing into a coyote and is the husband to Anska, the personification of the earth itself. The Shampi of the Choctaw is described as one of the witches, demons, and monsters that came with the Choctaw people. All of the evil spirits of the Choctaws have followed them on their long journey from the western part of North America. That is to say, the Shampi followed the Choctaw people across the continent to their new home. Details like this show that the Shampi is supposed to be interpreted as a spiritual being, not an animal. The 4 nondescript huge beasts, or deluge monsters, in a Wichita story are probably supposed to represent personifications of the 4 cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west. Iktomi of the Sioux is a shape-shifting Loki-like trickster spirit or god. He often appears as a spider, but as a shapeshifter he can take the form of any animal he wishes. Many of these are clearly supernatural beings that don't sound like the common idea of Bigfoot either. Giants. Probably the most common type of creatures put on native Bigfoot lists are that of giants. As I have stated before, many of these giants are not described. They are just referred to as giants, and with almost all the stories, we are given every indication that they should be interpreted as giant humans, not ape men. They live in giant wooden houses, and boil water in giant kettles over giant fires, and wear giant shirts. Some of them are described as being ridiculous in size. A Tlingit giant is as tall as the trees. A Coeur d'Alene giant is taller than the highest teepees, so that they look down the smoke hole. The giant in the Comanche story, the woman and the dwarf, is capable of lifting up entire houses with his bare hand. The giant of the Columbia lives underwater and swallows canoes that pass over its mouth. There is a demon so huge that its hand could stretch across the entire lake. In a Micmac story, there are giants whose upright forms would have risen far above the clouds. A giant of the Flathead has a belly that fills a whole valley and has lava for blood. The Skookum of the Clackamas, included on 3 different lists, is not described much beyond its tongue, which is 2 miles long. So long that he was in the habit of reaching it forth and catching people as he chose. Some giants were so massive that they literally became mountains. Around 12 of the giants, or 7% of the overall Bigfoot-like creatures, were stone giants, giants explicitly stated to be made out of rock and stone. Che Halam Che, the rock giant, carries on his back a big burden basket, which, like himself, is a rock. In the basket is a long spike which pierces bodies when they are thrown in, so they cannot escape. The Otene Yarhead, or stonish giants of the Iroquois, were covered with hard skin. One giant near Cardiff had skin that became hard and changed into scales, which alone would turn an arrow. On their right big toe, a long quartz spike grows up to 6 feet long. His body was obsidian, volcanic glass, and when the flesh was burned off, the obsidian burst and flew in all directions and scattered among the tribes for the use of all. The rock giant of Tamalpais, Lupu Oyes, even disguises himself as a giant boulder in the woods that children can play on. Most of these stone giants have a single weak spot that heroes can target, like an Achilles heel, or the Death Star's thermal exhaust port, a common mythic trope that can be found in stories of heroes fighting monsters all around the world. He was all rock, except a place on his throat where he wore an abalone shell. Some of these weak spots can be kinda funny. You can't hit these Soapitses. Their bodies are made of rock. Their only vulnerable place is in the anus. So he shot at his penis, and that is how he killed the giant. The giant is like a rock. Flesh or stone, these giants are almost always something more akin to the giant in Jack and the Beanstalk than a Bigfoot. Dwarves. At the other end of the spectrum were dwarves, stories about little people. Included in Kathy Strand's collection were several stories about beings smaller than your average human, sometimes by a lot. The cannibal dwarves that serve as the villains in a Nunavut story act pretty much exactly like humans. They have cook fires, live in houses, and try to trick the hero of the story into eating human flesh. There is no indication that they should be interpreted as anything other than evil little people. The little man with hair all over of the Choctaw is described more like a cheerful and crafty hobbit or leprechaun than an ape-like Bigfoot. Included on Suttle's list were the earth dwarves of the Twana, who live in little nooks and crannies and steal human souls. The strange creature of the mountain, described in a Yupik story, is said to stand about a foot off the ground. Oh my goodness, a very tiny, adorable, cat-sized Bigfoot. Or, alternatively, you could interpret it as a creature with arms so long, it walks with its hands, like Sebulba from Star Wars. Either way, none of these creatures sound particularly Bigfoot-like. Wild Indians. Another huge chunk of the creatures on the list can be classified as quote-unquote wild Indians. They are not supposed to be another species or anything. In most cases, they are explicitly stated to just be individual Native Americans, or other tribes of Native Americans that the storytellers believe became wild, or feral, or evil. The reasons for why they were considered wild varied. Spiritual possession. A significant amount of the stories discussed how a human who engaged in cannibalism or some other taboo could be magically transformed into a monster or possessed by an evil spirit as a result of that crime. The most famous example of this belief is the Wendigo, an evil spirit that can possess human beings and fill them with insatiable hunger. The spirit and the person they possess are often conflated together as one. A Cree version of this same spirit, the Wetiko, appears in several Bigfoot-believing lists. However, this idea is clearly contradicted by the official Algonquian definition of the creature. It states that a Wetiko is a cannibal monster or spirit that possesses a person, rendering them monstrous. Wetikos are clearly spiritual beings that merely possess humans. They are not Bigfoots. At the Expedition Bigfoot Museum, a mannequin portraying a native shaman or dancer wears this fearsome green and red mask. This well-made replica is based on an authentic Native American mask and depicts a Gaget, a being described by the Haida. This particular mask has been repeatedly used by Bigfoot-believing sources as a Bigfoot mask. The Expedition Bigfoot Museum's logo appears to be heavily inspired by the mask, and it even serves as the cover for the book Rainy Coast Sasquatch. The word Gaget is likewise featured on almost every native Bigfoot list I could find. So for Bigfooters, the Gaget of the Haida appears to be one of the strongest and most popular examples of a Bigfoot in Native American culture and art. According to a comprehensive Haida language dictionary, a Gaget or Gagid is defined as a wild man. The wild man will get you. A rather vague definition that could be interpreted in several ways. The actual mask so often used in Bigfoot media is currently held by the American Museum of Natural History in New York. This beautiful wooden mask was originally carved and painted by the famous Haida artist Charles Edenshaw. It was either purchased from or donated to the museum by a member of his family in the year 1905. I emailed the museum to find out if they had any description of the mask accompanying it when it was purchased, as this could help us understand how it should be properly interpreted by the original artist. The museum's reply stated that the mask was cataloged with a label that described the mask as a Gaget, someone who has barely escaped drowning and has lost his or her mind. Like the Wetiko, a Gaget is meant to be a person, a human being, who has lost their mind and become wild in a mental or spiritual sense, something closer to a zombie or demon-possessed human. This interpretation has been confirmed by other native sources. A similar Gagged mask is currently being sold by Reg Davison, another Haida Nation artist and a descendant of Charles Edenshaw. He describes a Gagged as a wild, otherworldly creature who has been transformed through a traumatic maritime experience. It is possible for a Gagged to be tamed and re-enter the human world again. Despite this information, Gaggeds continue to be included on most Bigfoot lists. Also in this category were straight-up evil humans. One of these included on the Bigfoot-like list was Iron Nose, a character from a Caddo story. He is described as a man who sits around a fire and wears a mask with an iron nose. The nose could shoot out like Pinocchio's to spear an unlucky child. Chanu, or Devil Cannibal of the Micmac, was a type of emaciated evil sorcerer or wizard who ate his own flesh and could conjure demons, lizards, and dragons from the earth. A couple were not even about wild Indians, but Indians of just slightly above average height. Supchet of the Wintu, for example, appears to just be a Goliath-like man who loves to wrestle and smoke a pipe. In the story, there is no indication that he's anything other than just a tall human man. Other Indians in these stories were considered wild for less supernatural reasons. These were humans that the more civilized Native Americans merely considered barbarians or savage because of their way of living. Barbarians. The Sitika described by the Northern Paiute were one small tribe of barbarians who acted as bandits and engaged in a long war with the Paiutes. Throughout the story, these people use bows and arrows, build boats, and use fire. They talked the same language as the Paiutes. Every indication of the story suggests that Sitika were nothing more than an ethnically related tribe of Native Americans that the Paiutes despised and exterminated in a war in the distant past. Smile of the Squamish are similarly described as wild people. The storyteller even provides a backstory to them. These people are said to be the descendants of a chief's daughter and a slave, who were abandoned but escaped into the mountains. The Smile are human descendants of humans. One Puyallup story describes the Tsiatko as a race of tall Indians. The storyteller states that it was largely because of this lack of any houses or villages that they were characterized as wild. The Statel, or wild tribes of Puget Sound, were described as cowardly people of the interior, and used to be savages, but they had become civilized now. The oldest story I could find that was alleged to be a Native American Bigfoot was inside the memoirs of a white American colonist dated to 1791 or 1806. According to this colonist, the Creek Indians believed that if a man got lost in the swamps of Georgia, he would eventually encounter a peculiar race of Indians whose women were incomparably beautiful, but their men fierce and warlike. They lived in settlements on a swamp island and built canoes. Some Creek storytellers believed them to be a fugitive remnant of the ancient Yamasses, who escaped massacre after a bloody and decisive conflict between them and the Creek Nation. These Yamasses were not Bigfoots, but another Indian nation that the Creeks had warred with and displaced. It appears that a small remnant community might have lived in hiding inside the Okefenokee swamp for a time. Not all these wild men stories are even about wild Indians. The Larien, or Bushmen of the Hare People, included in Giants, Cannibals, and Monsters, explicitly describes the Larien as foreign people who lost their way and became transformed into evil dwellers of the wild. They speak white man's language. All the white people who got lost in the Indian Wars became Bushmen. They might even have guns, but usually they have knives. Based on these descriptions, the Bushmen seem to not be Bigfoots, but literal American or Russian soldiers who just got lost in the woods. Many times, when these Native American storytellers say wild people or wild men, they are supposed to be understood as literal wild people or wild men, human beings that have turned to a less civilized way of living in the secluded wilderness. They are not a separate species. Included in this category of wild men was, to my surprise, the original story that gave us the word Sasquatch. The Origins of Sasquatch. Although many people know the word Sasquatch and commonly use it as a synonym for Bigfoot, few learn where it originally came from. As far as I've been able to uncover, Sasquatch first appeared as a word, at least to the public, on April 1st, 1929. It was coined by a Canadian schoolteacher named John W. Burns, and is most likely an English rendering of the native Halkomelem word, Saskits or Sasquatch. Burns was a government official and teacher who lived on the Chehalis Nation Reservation in Harrison Mills from 1925 to 1945. Living on the reservation for 20 years, Burns learned a great deal about the native beliefs and traditions and heard a lot of stories. He is often credited with providing the world with the first official set of Sasquatch stories. First for the April 1929 edition of Maclean's magazine, and later for the January 1940 edition of the magazine The Wide World. His article for the 1929 magazine is titled Introducing BC's Hairy Giants, while the 1941 is titled The Hairy Giants of British Columbia. Despite their importance to Bigfoot lore, both these sources are somewhat difficult to find now. There used to be a website that hosted scans of the 1929 article, but it appears to have gone down. I was lucky enough to have kept screenshots of the pages on a hard drive. As for the 1940 magazine, I have yet to find a single method to obtain a copy of it. The closest I have found is Kathy Strain's book, Giants, Cannibals, and Monsters, where she provides a copied version of its Sasquatch story, though I would have liked to have read it in its original format. I think it is partly because of this lost media aspect that few people have seen how Sasquatch was used in its original context, or how a Sasquatch was originally described. Over these two sources, Burns provided at least 4 separate eyewitness accounts or tales of encounters with Sasquatches. These Indian informants were Peter Williams, Charlie Victor, a man known only as Mr. Point, and a woman named Seraphine Long. I'll try to provide a link so you can read these yourselves, but generally the Sasquatch as it is described in these stories is far from the creature of today. Charlie Victor's account is the most detailed. He had been in what he thought was one of their houses, and met and spoke to one of their women. He states that the strange people, of whom there are but few now, rarely seen and seldom met, are known by the name of Sasquatch, or the Hairy Mountain Men. Charlie recalled that one day while he was hunting with his dog, he encountered something I took for a bear. I shoot, and it fell with a thud on the ground. Murder, oh my! I spoke to myself in surprising and alarm, for the thing I had shot looked to me like a white boy. He was nude. He was about 12 or 14 years of age. Charlie grew closer and found it was a hairy boy that was screaming in pain from the injury. Drawn by the loud noises, a second stranger came from the depths of the forest. The hairy creature, for that is what it was, walked toward me without the slightest fear. The wild person was a woman. Her face was almost Negro black, and her long straight hair fell to her waist. In height, she would be about 6 feet. She cast a hasty glance at the boy. She saw he was bleeding. She turned upon me savagely, and in the Douglas tongue said, "You have shot my friend." I explained in the same language, for I'm part Douglas myself, that I had mistaken the boy for a bear, and that I was sorry. The woman does not respond, but does a ritualistic dance around the boy. In her hand she carried something like a snake, about 6 feet in length. I believe it was the intestine of some animal. Whatever it was, she constantly struck the ground with it. The Sasquatch woman stares Charlie down, and he drops his gun. She then took the boy and disappeared into the mountain. Burns goes on to state that he, Charlie, did not think that the boy belonged to the Sasquatch people because he was white, and she called him her friend. Charlie finishes his tale by concluding, "It is my own opinion, since I met the wild woman 15 years ago, that because she spoke the Douglas tongue, these creatures must be related to the Indian." In another tale recorded by Burns, a woman by the name of Seraphine Long is kidnapped by a young man Sasquatch, who smears tree gum over her eyes to seal them shut. She is taken to a big cave in the mountains where the Sasquatch live. The floor was covered with animal skins, soft to touch and better preserved than we preserved them. A small fire in the middle of the floor gave all the light there. She lived among the Sasquatch family for several months. I had learned a few words of their tongue, which is not unlike the Douglas dialect. By the end of the story, the woman is released by the young Sasquatch and returns to her tribe. She eventually gives birth to a baby, presumably the son of the Sasquatch man. It dies soon after. It is curious that in both stories, the Sasquatch are explicitly stated to speak the Douglas dialect, or Douglas tongue. That is to say, the language of the Douglas First Nation, or Hawkshaw. Sasquatches are wild humans, humans that simply live in isolation from other tribes in the deep wilderness. They were not ape men, or the modern concept of Bigfoot, but were people. Stories like this shouldn't exactly be surprising to find after the countless wars and forced removal of Indians from their original lands. Some families, or maybe even whole tribes, may have tried to live in seclusion in the remote regions of North America for a while. Even famous Bigfoot experts like John Green admitted that the Sasquatch with which Mr. Burns' readers were familiar were basically giant Indians. Although avoiding civilization, they had clothes, fire, weapons, and the like, and lived in villages. They were called hairy giants, it is true, but this was taken to mean that they had long hair on their heads, something along the lines of today's hippies. Oh, and to top it all off, Burns once repeated these stories for the December 1954 edition of Liberty magazine, and revealed, his casual racism, I think? The Chehalis Indians are intelligent, but unimaginative folk, inventing so many factually detailed stories concerning their adventures among the giants would be quite beyond their powers. In other words, he is stating that Sasquatches exist because Indians are not creative enough to make them up. In any case, such a shocking realization makes me wonder why we even use the word Sasquatch to refer to Bigfoot in the first place, since its original meaning is so different. Basket women. 25 out of the 154 stories, or 16%, feature a being carrying a basket or net or jar or bundle on their backs. Baskets featured so prominently in these stories that it was just hard to ignore. All over North America, there are tales of a female being referred to as Basket Woman, the evil old lady with her basket. To this day, they still tell of the Basket Lady. The Kawaka, I think that's how you pronounce that. Just look at that word for me. Carries a basket on her back, in which she carries away children. The Basket Woman was an evil witch-like being that kidnapped children in the night. She did so by capturing them in her basket or bag, and after taking them to her lair, the Basket Woman would eat the children by roasting them over a fire or cooking them in pots. They preferred and hunted children as better eating. Each had a big basket on her back, and would come home with it filled with everything bad. Zanakwa, she captures children who are crying, and who venture into the forest, carrying them away in a basket on her back to devour them. Most of the time the Basket Woman is female, but sometimes he is a basket man, and sometimes he is a stone giant or a chimera as well. Many of the creatures of the previously discussed categories have elements of Basket Women stories mixed in, and they are by no means mutually exclusive. For example, there is a stone giant of the Shoshone, Soapitsi, had a conical basket for packing things in. It was lined with pitch. He threw people inside, and they stuck and couldn't escape. Sanahaha always carried a big basket of thorns on his back. When he caught anyone, he threw him over his back into the basket. One Basket Woman story by the Wintu described her using hot pitch to cover children's eyes, which sounds eerily similar to how the male Sasquatch abducts the woman in J.W. Burns' story. Basket Woman stories are almost always geared towards children, and frequently start or end with a sinister warning to stay close to your parents and your home. "Don't go out there in the dark," the young father warned his children. "Stay here close by the fire where we can see you," he added. "They must beware the Basket Lady." To this day, they still tell of the Basket Lady, who now lives on in the many different places those sparks landed. "Do not stray too far from the light of your family fire. or go off into the dark of night, making a lot of noise, because we cannot be sure where all the sparks went. The extremely wide prevalence of these similar stories would be compelling if basket women were described like Bigfoot, but they are not. In the stories, they are often individual beings, not a race or a species. They also always use baskets, live in houses, wear dresses, and roast children over fires. Like the giants, they're basically just your typical run-of-the-mill fairy tale villains. And here's the thing, you very likely have heard a variation of the basket woman story, because it is basically a staple of every culture around the world. When the children were bad, they were warned that the Honka man would mark their arms. He was about the same as the boogeyman is to the white children. Every culture has its own basket woman or basket man. If it be El Coco of Spain, or the Sack Man of Latin America, or Baba Yaga of Russia, or the Boogeyman of America, the details are pretty much the same. They are all stories about a being that kidnaps disobedient children in the night, often carrying them off in a sack or basket. Spooky characters like these have been used by adults to scare their children into being good and not staying out after dark for thousands of years. The prevalence of these stories doesn't mean basket women are real. As any parent will no doubt agree, it was just an easy and effective way to keep little children out of danger. It is perhaps intriguing that such a similar story appears to have been invented several times by humans around the world, and independently, but this is beyond the scope of this video. The point is, another huge chunk of native Bigfoot stories appear to fall into this category. Boogeyman-like beings made up to scare children into behaving. The basket women are also not Bigfoot. Summary of the 89%. If this diagram looks crazy, that's because it is. This was an incredibly diverse collection of creatures, spirits, monsters, and characters lumped together as if they were all talking about the same thing. But when you really take the time to read each one of them individually, the sheer amount of differences pile up. The Native Bigfoot list is an assortment of unrelated stories and creatures, the vast majority of which don't sound like anything like our modern concept of Bigfoot. Some were so much of a stretch, I struggled to find what part of the story Bigfooters like Kathy were trying to claim was Bigfoot or Bigfoot-like. It is as if someone grouped a whole slew of random pop culture monsters and characters all together as if they formed some kind of coherent whole. You could have just as easily have done this with the monsters of European folklore. You know that big guy Goliath King David fought? Guess what? He was a Sasquatch the whole time. And you know that really tall Roman emperor? He was just a Bigfoot the whole time too. You might think that's a joke, but that is a legitimate thing I've seen some Bigfoot believers claim. Look at this chart that was in Expedition Bigfoot Museum. Like, what? Okay, one thing at a time. These are very different beings from very different stories with very different personalities and descriptions. Lumping them together as Bigfoot-like or Native American names for Sasquatch is such a gross oversimplification and mischaracterization. It is in my scholarly opinion that 89% of the Bigfoot-like creatures and stories just flat out shouldn't be on the list. As we have seen, even the original Sasquatch story doesn't really meet the standards of what we would recognize as a Sasquatch today. But don't just take it from me. Here are some customer reviews on Amazon that felt the same exact way. Thought it would be interesting to see the links between Bigfoot-like creature stories across the states. But really only a handful of the stories were really recognizable as being Sasquatch-like. The vast majority were bearer-rabbit-like creation myths that just happened to have a giant in the story. It still felt very stretchy to attach any Sasquatch link. There are many giant myths in Europe too, but you wouldn't attach any other meaning to it. Hey, I said the same thing. Great minds think alike, I guess, random Amazon customer. So after all that, this left only 17 creatures, or 11% of the original list we started out with, that were actually described as something vaguely like a Bigfoot. Some people might think I was being overly strict, but I really wasn't. Mixed in with this 17 was me being incredibly generous. One of the 17 was described as having cow hooves. and another had a penis, which is so long that it must be rolled up and carried in the arms. It terrifies its enemies by striking tree trunks and breaking branches with its uncoiled organ. Oh man. I could go on to talk about each individual one of these in depth and highlight their many inconsistencies to the modern idea of Bigfoot. But for me, I felt it was more fitting to focus on just one, because not only was it widely regarded as the most compelling, I found that it was a good microcosm of the whole Native American Bigfoot phenomena in general. The Hairy Man. The Mayak-Datach of the Yokuts, just like the Gagat of the Haida, is a favorite for Bigfoot believers to cite in discussions of the native origins of Bigfoot. The Yokuts reside in modern-day California. Like many of the stories and beings we have discussed already, the actual descriptions of the Mayak-Datach, or Hairy Man, in Yokut stories are not particularly compelling to the Bigfoot Sasquatch believing cause, at least in my opinion. The 3 stories collected by Kathy Strain herself in the early 1990s don't describe him in much detail aside from walking on 2 legs, having big feet, and being hairy. One of the stories, How People Were Made, is a story about all the animals of the earth taking turns on what they think the first human should look like and be like. Each one has their say: fish, hummingbird, eagle, turtle, lizard, owl, condor, coyote, and lastly, hairy man. But there is a final disagreement between Coyote and Hairy Man. Coyote says, "People should be just like me because I am smart and tricky, so have them walk on all 4s. Hairy Man shook his head and said, "People should walk on 2 legs like me." Now, curiously, a friend of mine, thank you Miles Greb, who lives near the Thule reservation of the Yokuts, purchased an official book published by the tribe themselves. In the 2008 book, Bigfoot and Other Stories, there is a version of this How People Were Made Yokut story that is very similar to Kathy Strain's version, except the tribal storytellers have replaced Hairy Man with Grizzly Bear. Its version goes like this: Eagle and Coyote made people by taking the clay from the earth and shaping it like a man and woman. Grizzly Bear said, "People should be able to stand on their hind legs like me, and they should have no tail." So take that information as you will. In any case, Coyote and Hairy Man agree to settle the disagreement by racing to a rock. Whoever wins decides if humans should walk on 2 legs or 4. Hairy Man, of course, wins. He actually just cheats, and the animals draw the 2-legged humans in the soil and breathe life into them. Proud of his creations, Hairy Man greets these newly formed humans, but the humans are frightened of his appearance and run away. This makes Hairy Man very sad. That is why when all the animals draw their pictures on the rock, Hairy Man drew himself sad. That is why Hairy Man's picture is crying to this day. This rock is now called Hakiyu, or the Painted Rock, and it still exists on the Thule reservation, along with the drawing of the crying Hairy Man. Bigfoot believers have focused on this rock and the painted figure a ton. As you have no doubt noticed, it serves as the cover for Kathy Strain's book. It is used on the Wikipedia page for Bigfoot under Indigenous and Early Records. Not 1, but 2 replicas of it are featured in the Expedition Bigfoot Museum. A book geared towards children that I found in the museum's gift shop showed a photo of the pictograph describing it as a male, female, and child hairy man. Was the Sasquatch a common animal to the Yokuts, or some kind of supernatural being? Famous Bigfooter Lauren Coleman has it proudly tattooed on his forearm, and recently the International Cryptozoology Museum in Portland, Maine displayed a painted reproduction, albeit temporarily. Within an About section for Kathy Strain in Christopher Murphy's Meet the Sasquatch, the painted rock is described as Bigfoot pictographs, the only known prehistoric paintings of Bigfoot. Elsewhere, Murphy states it is reasonable to assume that details on how a Bigfoot looked and behaved are only present in Yokuts culture because of a direct observation of a flesh and blood creature. The Mayak-Datach appeared on 5 out of the 6 native Bigfoot lists I examined. It is not unfair to say that the Mayak-Datach, or Hairy Man of the Painted Rock, is the crown jewel of the Bigfoot community when it comes to the Native American Bigfoot. But what do the actual Yokuts think about this? At this point in my research, I was kind of sick and tired of speculating what a particular tribe or native person meant when they gave an anthropologist an interview 20 to 100 years ago. So I thought to myself, why don't I literally just ask? Almost all these tribes still exist and have emails on their websites that you can contact. For this project, I emailed a bunch of different tribes, but the only one that got back to me was a Yokuts representative from the Thule Reservation, which was perfect for the hairy man and the painted rock. The interview I had with them over the phone was incredibly helpful and revealing. First off, they revealed to me that Mayak Datach is often mistranslated in Bigfoot sources, as it does not directly translate to hairy man. It is also mispronounced by Bigfooters as Mayak Datat, when it should really sound like Mayak Datach. In the Yokuts language, it literally translates to Mayak, meaning big, and Datach, meaning foot. It is also not the being's proper traditional name. His true name is not taught. It is sacred and only spoken in prayer during special ceremonies or gatherings. As for the wider Bigfoot community's interpretation of the painted rock and Mayak Datach, the Yokuts representative stated that, "We know it as a spirit. It's a spiritual being. It can be in our physical existence or in the other world." They went on to say that, "We kind of had problems with Kathy Strain because she did come up and interview some of our elders quite a while ago, and the story that she was given was the story we tell our kids. Like, don't go outside, something's gonna get you. Back in the day when our elders were little, they were told not to go out, or you're gonna get eaten by Mayak Datach." She, Kathy Strain, took it literally and has gone on to lecture saying that that's what they're known for, that's what they do, when really he isn't, because in our culture it is a very sacred being. He's a caretaker of our land and culture. When people pass, he is one of the spirits that walk with them. When asked about the Basket Woman stories, the representative stated that the Basket Woman was the scary story told to kids. It was a scary kid story that is simplistic and doesn't reflect the authentic beliefs of adults. People are passing it off as if it was a tribe of cannibals. It is laughable but really upsetting because it was a kid's story. When asked about Bigfoot believers using the painted rock and Mayak Datach in publications and museums, the tribal representative said that often they don't take the time to ask one of us. It is such a big topic now. If people are going to be publicizing and giving so much attention to the Bigfoot, at least interject by setting stuff straight. In short, from our discussion, I learned that Mayak Datach is an incredibly sacred and spiritual being. And the Bigfoot community's interpretation of him as a flesh and blood creature, or an ape-like species, is not correct and doesn't reflect the actual beliefs of the Yokuts. Furthermore, the painted rock and its image are regarded as sacred to the Yokuts. The way Bigfooters have used it in recent years is considered both disrespectful and exploitative. The Thule River tribe asks that their sacred imagery not be reproduced without express permission, and that violations of this be reported to the tribe. Well, actually, as we close out, there was something I encountered regularly throughout my research and thought was important to emphasize. The indigenous side of so many of these stories was often drowned out by that of Bigfoot believers. At one point in Kathy Strain's Giants, Cannibals, and Monsters, I saw a footnote for the Caddo story about the cannibal Iron Nose. Note, Iron Nose is likely a mistranslation of shape features. In some ways, I think this footnote is emblematic of the whole Bigfoot community's treatment of Native American stories in general. Not only does it contradict details within the story itself, later his nose literally does shoot out like a spear to attack the hero, the footnote is also entirely unsourced. I tried to see where Kathy Strain could have gotten this footnote from. I bought a copy of the book she was citing, but found that the original story contains no such footnote. And when I checked up on the Caddo storyteller, Mr. Wing, who originally told it, I discovered that he has unfortunately been dead since 1907. So there was no way for either Kathy or me to have interviewed him personally to get the correct translation, something only he would really know. This book in fact only contains the English translations of Mr. Wing's stories as they were recorded by a white author named George A. Dorsey in the early 1900s. The version Mr. Wing told in his original language at that time does not survive. As far as I can tell, the footnote appears to just be Kathy Strain's opinion, inserted into the original Kato story and presented as fact in the hopes nobody would question it. But who knows, maybe she got it from a source I haven't been able to track down yet. Curious about other books cited in Giants, Cannibals, and Monsters, I managed to get a physical copy of The Hare Indians and Their World by Hiroku Suhara, a somewhat difficult to obtain book. I discovered that when comparing the two side by side, there were big portions of Hiroku Suhara's text that were omitted from Kathy Strain's reproduction in Giants, Cannibals, and Monsters. One section was even omitted mid-paragraph. Here are some excerpts from the omitted sections talking about the Larien, or Bushman legends. Both Indians of the neighboring tribes and white men are believed to become Bushmen. Since various Indians stopped fighting wars, there have been few Indian Bushmen. These days, Bushmen are only white men, said my informant. 2 natives told their tales of Bushmen wandering through an area, and one of them was very convinced that they were Russians. Tales of wandering white man have persisted from these camps all summer. You do not have to be scared of Bushmen. Nowadays, Bushmen are only white people, and they cannot harm us. The bad white man will be caught by the police. Okay, the image in my head of like a Bigfoot being caught by the police is kind of funny. Who knows why these portions of the text were conspicuously omitted from Giants, Cannibals, and Monsters, but one cannot doubt that they further show that the Bushmen of the Hare probably shouldn't be interpreted as Bigfoots, and one would not get this more complete image without tracking down and reading the original source that Kathy cited, and seeing its original context. Bigfoot believers attempting to correct details of these Native American stories, or add their own interpretations, was something I found a lot. From the introduction of Giants, Cannibals, and Monsters, Kathy Strain states that the Cherokee story of the snake with big feet is about a snake with big feet that becomes human and marries the chief's daughter. I believe the snake represents a Bigfoot, as denoted by the big feet, and the story is designed to help the reader accept that a Bigfoot married a human female. The Nelchina tale of the big man with the little hat is reinterpreted by Kathy as this name came about because from a distance the creature's pointed head, sagittal crest, made it appear as though it is wearing a little hat. The source cited for this interpretation is a 2004 book by Bigfoot believer Christopher L. Murphy, and as far as I can tell it is his outsider opinion and not a Native Nelchina one. It is just an outsider's opinion on the Native American word, and it's weird seeing another person cite that as if that's a reliable source. To go on a bit of a tangent, there is a photo of a woven basket in Kathy Strain's section on the Yokuts hairy man in Giants, Cannibals, and Monsters. The caption states that the lower row of this basket depicts the hairy man. Intrigued by this claim, I was able to track down the original uncropped version of this photo. Taken around the year 1900, it is currently housed in the library of the University of Southern California. There are actually several photos of this unnamed Yokuts basket maker. From my research, I suspect she might be the famous Mary Dick Topino, or Mrs. Britches. In any case, the university's official description does not mention the hairy man. It merely states that the woman is working on a basket with a human figure pattern. This holding hands pattern seems to have been pretty common among Yokut basket makers in the late 1800s to early 1900s. The Rhode Island School of Design Museum and other private collections contain very similar baskets, perhaps made by the same woman in the photographs. The description for all these unfortunately do not mention the hairy man either, only identifying the stick figure-like people as male or female humans. Like the Iron Nose footnote, I am again unsure where Kathy Strain got the information for the caption in her book, explicitly identifying the lower figures in the pattern as hairy man. I have yet to find a source supporting this, and based on what we've already seen, it very well might be just her personal opinion again. But benefit of the doubt, maybe she asked a native Yokuts about the photo back in the 90s, and they said that was a hairy man. Who knows? Hello, update from the future. This doesn't appear to be the case. After recording the original script, I once again reached out and asked the Tule River Tribe representative. They couldn't definitively identify the woman in the photo, but she might be the wife of Dick Francisco, Lucia Francisco. And this tracks with information I could find online. As for the pattern on the basket, they explicitly disagreed with Kathy Strain's caption. They said, and I am quoting here, "The basket pattern shown is called a spring dance design and depicts Yokuts people at a springtime ceremony. This interpretation, directly from the tribe itself, matches a caption for a Yokuts basket with the same design in a book from 1909. The author of this book identifies it as Fine Yokut Dance Basket. These are dancing humans, not hairy man." So yeah, in my personal opinion, I think the source was literally just made up, because it's not even right. Okay, back to the video. Whatever their original intentions, Bigfoot believers repeatedly attempt to cherry-pick, ignore, correct, or make elaborate explanations for details of these Native American stories, ostensibly to make them fit their idea of Bigfoot. He's not wearing a hat or mask. The Native Americans were just trying to say he had a pointed head or face. The snake with big feet isn't really about a snake with big feet. It's secretly coded to talk about Bigfoot. The Mayak Datach isn't actually a spiritual being. The Yokuts themselves are mistaken and don't know what they're talking about. They really meant to say he was a flesh and blood creature. We should ignore the Skookum's 2-mile-long tongue, or the stone giant's rocky skin, or double faces. These are all just metaphors or something. Just ignore all the details that don't fit our narrative. At the end of the day, these are all just excuses. Excuses for why so many of these stories don't exactly sound like the modern image of Bigfoot. And seeing these primarily white researchers taking these Native American stories and essentially going, well, they actually meant this, gives off a kind of bad, condescending vibe to me. As skeptic and science writer Daniel Luxton wisely concluded in his book Abominable Science, it is an exercise in confirmation bias. Bigfoot enthusiasts look back over native lore with an expectation of finding Bigfoot. They seize on any tales about a fabulous creature that resembles the Bigfoot they expect to find, while ignoring or reinterpreting the stories that do not. If these are the best stories Bigfoot believers can find, I don't think they are particularly impressive or compelling towards the Bigfoot cause. If you need to include Iron Nose, or Doubleface, or Dwarves to fill up your list, it seems like quite a stretch. Not to mention that some of the actual living indigenous communities explicitly disagree with how their stories are being interpreted and treated. It is desperate, in my opinion. Bigfooters are trying to ventriloquize these Native American storytellers, sometimes long after they have passed away, attempting to make them say what they want them or wish them to say. And I think this behavior works entirely contrary to the claims many of these authors make up front. From the opening of Giants, Cannibals, and Monsters, this work is dedicated to the native people of North America. These are your stories. Thank you for giving us a piece of knowledge about a creature that you have always known. Conclusion. So to answer the question that jump-started this project, yes, Bigfoot and Sasquatch do appear in some Native American stories, but the native versions of these creatures and beings bear no resemblance to the one modern Bigfoot believers have tried to retroactively force into these stories. It is not their Bigfoot. I personally think that minimizing this long list of at times sacred beings to something like Native American Sasquatch names doesn't appreciate the sheer uniqueness and diversity of these stories, nor does it respect the communities that have chosen to share them with us. Of course, not all Native American tribes or even individuals will have the same opinion or interpretation of Bigfoot. Despite all the research I've done, maybe I missed something. I am totally open to hearing more indigenous stories in the future, and I would like to hear these stories from native peoples directly, and not the filtered version that might be taken out of context or misrepresented. These are just my conclusions based on the current information available to me. This project allowed me to encounter a whole cross-section of Native American mythology, legends, parables, and history that I never would have read about otherwise. Just look at this massive pile of books I got. It was not only fun, but fascinating, and it showed me just how underappreciated Native American culture is. It's kind of disappointing and maybe embarrassing to me that it took a hairy ape man to get me to read about them. In any case, I'd advise anyone to take the time to read about these and similar stories. There's something beautiful about reading traditions that have survived so much and been passed down for so long. They deserve respect and to be appreciated. And with that, thank you so much for watching. Oh boy, that was quite the long video. But yes, we're done finally. Thank you for all watching.